As we get closer to Election Day, we're checking in with some of the candidates you'll see on the ballot this November. Right now, we're honored to be joined by U.S. Senator Tom Tillis, who will be facing off with Democratic challenger Cunningham. Senator Tillis, thanks for the time today.
Thank you.
Let's get right to COVID-19. It's something that's affected each and every one of us in some way. What is your take on the response here in the state and nationally so far, and what could be done differently in your mind?
Well, I think, we've learned so much about this virus since it first came, and shame on China for not sharing information with us that could have reduced the severity of what we're all experiencing, both in terms of our health and the impact on the economy. But I think I've said frequently on my 55th telephone town hall yesterday that these elected leaders at the state level, at the federal level, and their advisors are working with the best available information. When we see a crisis, we try to fix it. When we had a shortfall with ventilators, we figured out a way with the Defense Production Act to get excess ventilators like we now have in North Carolina. When we understand that social distancing is critically important, we ask people to wear masks, wash their hands, use hand sanitizer, and keep a safe distance away from people. Now what we need to do, there are changes. So I think what we've got to do is communicate to the population that they play a very important role in us ultimately defeating this virus.
Senator, I heard you mention shame on China. The president has mentioned holding China accountable. You've said that in other interviews. How can the United States hold China accountable for what you perceive to be negligence on their part?
Well, I think there are various things that we have to do. I've implemented I've proposed an 18-point plan to hold China accountable on 3 different fronts. The first front is how they handled the COVID virus. The first act of human rights abuse was against an ophthalmologist in Wuhan province who circulated a message to his colleagues that he is seeing something he hasn't seen before and they needed to wear face masks and take this contagious disease seriously. They silenced that ophthalmologist months, probably 2 months before we had our first case in the United States. That was wrong. The Communist Party, not the Chinese people, need to be held accountable. They also destroyed test samples. They didn't freely share information, sequencing information that's vitally important with the virus on a timely basis. And there are a number of other countries. This isn't just about U.S. wanting to hold China accountable. The world population blames China for this pandemic, and we need to hold them accountable so that we avoid this same kind of pandemic threat in the future. We also have to hold them accountable for having far too many manufacturing facilities, personal protective equipment, drug manufacturing in China. We have to get it out of China, bring it back home, or at least bring it to a jurisdiction where we can rely more on them, like our allies and partners. And then finally, the American people and people in North Carolina need to know the malign activities that their military is engaged in. And that really summarizes my 3-point initiative that I'm going to continue to work on in the Senate.
Back here at home, the economy is starting to tick up a little bit, but there's still a lot of people struggling, especially here in North Carolina. What do you and your colleagues in Congress need to do to make sure those people are taken care of?
Well, I think I support an additional round of economic stimulus checks to the people who are struggling the most. That's why I support an extension of the unemployment compensation through the end of the year, and also support the extension of the Paycheck Protection Program. We have so many businesses that I refer to as first in, last out industries. Think about tourism and how important it is in the state. Hotels, restaurants, motor coaches, they all have to be eligible for Paycheck Protection Program as they start ramping back up again. And you said you're going to face off with my challenger. Ask him why he criticized the Paycheck Protection Program when his own company saw the need to have it to continue their business operations. We need to get the politics out of what we're trying to do for the follow-up for economic support and get everybody on a bipartisan basis behind it.
Colleges and universities here in North Carolina are back in session. UNC Chapel Hill announcing this week that they will go back to remote only. The president was quoted this week, closing colleges and universities could cost lives. Do you agree with that assessment? And if not, what do you think needs to happen as we all try to get back to a sense of normalcy?
Well, I'll give you a classic example of a university or college that's only about 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. Davidson College in the Lake Norman area has reopened. I just read this morning their requirements for social distancing, wearing a mask when you're walking and talking on the campus. Figuring out a safe way to open up these colleges is critically important. At least in that setting, we may have a better shot at getting the segment of the population that is doing the least in terms of social distancing, and that's the younger population, not just college students, but the younger demographic is clearly not complying with a lot of the COVID and governor's guidelines for social distancing. That's ultimately what led to UNC's decision. But we've got to open up these schools. I do believe that we may be able to create a safer environment there than we may have if they're just logging in virtually. It's got to be done safely, but I do believe it has to be done.
As your campaign moves ahead towards the November election, you mentioned those 55 telephone town halls you've done. How much different is it this time around on the campaign trail than it was 6 years ago?
Well, it's very different. I am getting out and having official visits, meeting with various businesses. I just met with one earlier this week who benefited, said it literally saved 200 jobs and likely their business through the Paycheck Protection Program. Campaigning is a combination of some in person, if we can assure social distancing requirements, and a lot of virtual environments like the one you and I are engaging in right now. But the town halls have been critically important. All we do is focus on COVID, the economic response, and how we can help constituents. And we've got to continue to do that through the election. I tell you, it's another reason why it's so hard for people to get information. I'm disappointed that Cal Cunningham refuses to debate us on the statewide stage. I think that the issues that are at stake in this election are very, very important, and we've got to have voters fully informed of the consequences of their vote on November 3rd.
One of the big stories here in Eastern North Carolina this week is the announcement that American Airlines will suspend service to here at Pitt Greenville Airport starting in October. What can you in Congress and your colleagues do to make sure regional airports like Pitt Greenville, like New Bern, Coastal Carolina Regional are taken care of so that the consumers here in Eastern North Carolina have options when it comes to air service?
We have to do it. It really relates back to those first in, last out industries. The airline industry, between business travel shutting down, leisure travel shutting down, was hit hard. We are proposing something. There's a deadline at the end of September, and I just actually corresponded with the mayor, your mayor, this morning, who's concerned with it. He's a great mayor and looking out for Greenville, but we have to provide a safety net for the airline industry while their revenues are down by almost 80%. That infrastructure, we run the risk of taking years to recover some of those flights if we don't provide the resources that they need to keep their employees on board. There will be tens of thousands of furloughs starting in October if we don't get the relief package passed. And support for the airline industry is intrinsically linked to hotels and travel and leisure. And, that's one of our most significant industries in North Carolina.
Before we let you go, we just want to ask you, what would you like to say to the voters here in Eastern North Carolina? Our coverage area spans about 29 counties here in the eastern part of the state, about a third of North Carolina. What do you want to say to the voters of Eastern North Carolina?
Well, I want to tell the voters there's a very stark contrast between me and my opponent, Cal Cunningham. Cal Cunningham raised taxes at the height of a recession. We cut taxes when I was Speaker of the House. We took regulations off of businesses. A lot of these smaller businesses and businesses in the rural community could be devastated by tax increases and more regulations. I've got a track record of relieving the burdens on rural areas and on businesses and on individuals. And my opponent, Cal Cunningham, has a track record of increasing tax burdens, taking advantage of tax incentives, and I think lining up behind a policy format from Chuck Schumer, the radical leader of the Democratic minority right now. If he becomes majority leader, I think it's going to be devastating for rural areas of the state, and it's going to be devastating for economic recovery.
Senator Tom Tillis, we appreciate taking the time to speak with us here in Eastern North Carolina today. Stay safe.
Thank you.